Imagine it's 15 July 1973. You are a 43-year-old masonry contractor living in Woodhull, Illinois, in the United States. Before sunrise, you are already awake, pulling on work boots still dusted with yesterday's cement. You own a small company, O.J. Sotelo and Sons Masonry, and every week you juggle the same hard math: truck fuel, brick deliveries, payroll, and the taxes taken out of your workers' checks. Your wife Naomi keeps the house running, the phone keeps ringing, and the business still looks alive from the road, with men climbing scaffolds and fresh walls rising one layer at a time. You tell yourself that if the company fails, at least bankruptcy will draw a clean line under the damage. Like a storm cellar under a farmhouse, it may not save the crop, but surely it will save the family. If you have ever wondered why some debts survive the very system built to erase debt, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a loophole or a legal technicality. It is a pattern, one written into law over more than a century. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes only a second and helps you stay ahead of what most people never think to look for. Then the letter arrives. The business goes under, the family goes bankrupt, and the federal government says that one part of the wreckage still belongs to you. Not the company. You. The Internal Revenue Service files a claim for $40,151.16 in payroll taxes that had been withheld from workers but never turned over. In 1978, in United States v. Sotelo, the Supreme Court agreed that this debt could follow Onofre Sotelo through bankruptcy because the money was never truly his to spend. That is where our story begins, because it reveals a truth most people only learn when it is too late. Bankruptcy is powerful, but it is not a magic eraser. Some debts are treated like broken contracts. Others are treated like promises to children, money held in trust, punishment ordered by a court, or harm done on purpose. And once the law puts a debt in one of those boxes, the fresh start that bankruptcy promises can start to look more like a door with 6 heavy locks. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Bankruptcy was never designed to forgive every kind of obligation. It was designed to sort obligations. Think of it like a harbor in a storm. Most ships can come in, drop anchor, and survive the night. But some cargo is marked with red paint. The harbor master will not take it. Congress has long argued that certain debts are too important, too public, or too morally loaded to wash away with the rest. The United States courts say these exceptions exist for public policy reasons. In plain English, that means lawmakers decided that some claims matter more than giving the debtor a full reset. That is the secret key to this whole subject. These debts do not survive because the law forgot them. They survive because the law singled them out. Child support and alimony survive because a family is not supposed to starve so that one person can start over. Many taxes survive because some tax money was collected on behalf of the government and never really belonged to the debtor. Criminal fines and restitution survive because bankruptcy is not supposed to cancel punishment. Most student loans survive because Congress, over decades, came to fear that borrowers would use bankruptcy too easily, even though the evidence for that fear was thin. And debts caused by fraud or deliberate harm survive because the law does not want bankruptcy to become a laundromat for bad acts. Once you see the rule, the cases stop looking random. They start lining up like iron nails in a magnetic field. Different years, different courts, different people, same underlying idea. If a debt is tied to support, public money, punishment, or wrongdoing, the law often treats it less like ordinary borrowing and more like a stain burned into the wood. You can paint over it, you can move the furniture, but it is still there. This brings us directly to the first kind of debt people cannot easily outrun, and historically it may be the most emotionally charged of all: support owed to a family. In June 1890, Annette B.W. Wetmore began a divorce and alimony action against her husband in New York. 2 years later, the court granted a final divorce decree. She received custody of their 3 minor children. The decree ordered $3,000 a year in alimony for her and another $3,000 a year for the education and maintenance of the children. By 13th of January 1899, the unpaid arrears had grown to $19,221.60. That was not a small sum. In today's language, it was the weight of years of missed support piled into one number. William Wetmore then went into bankruptcy and later argued that the old arrears should be swept away like any other debt. The Supreme Court refused. In Wetmore v. Markoe in 1904, the court said this was not an ordinary debt founded on contract. It was the legal and moral duty of support. That sentence matters. The court was drawing a line between money you owe because of a bargain and money you owe because other human beings depend on you to eat, sleep indoors, and grow up with some minimum of stability. Support debt, the court said, did not become harmless just because it had been written into a judgment. The paper changed, The nature of the duty did not. That logic has echoed for more than a century. Modern bankruptcy law still treats child support and alimony as special. In 2005, Congress tightened the screws even further through the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act. That law pushed domestic support obligations to the front of the priority line, limited how far bankruptcy's automatic stay could shield debtors from support enforcement, and made it harder to move forward in a repayment plan unless ongoing support was being paid. In plain English, the law told debtors something blunt. Whatever else happens in bankruptcy, support comes first. And this was not abstract. It never is. When support goes unpaid, the human cost does not arrive as a headline. It arrives as groceries bought on a credit card, a rent check mailed late, a winter coat postponed, a child hearing stress in the kitchen before understanding the words. Support debt is like a missing beam in a roof. The damage does not always show on day one, but over time the whole house starts to sag. The scale is enormous even now. In fiscal year 2024, the National Child Support System reported $29.5 billion in total child support collections distributed and said it served 12.2 million children. It also reported that only 65% of current support due was collected. That one number tells you almost everything. Even with courts, agencies, wage withholding, and decades of policy behind it, a large share of support that should have arrived on time still did not. That is why bankruptcy law treats these debts like live wires. Lawmakers do not see them as yesterday's bills. They see them as tonight's dinner. Here is the deeper mechanism. A credit card company can spread losses across millions of accounts. A bank can write off a bad loan and keep operating. A child cannot diversify a missing parent payment. A former spouse carrying the daily cost of care cannot hedge it. There is no backup market for broken household support. That is why these debts stick. The law is not just protecting money. It is protecting dependence. Now here is where it gets interesting. The second class of debt that often survives bankruptcy is tax debt, and especially money that was collected from other people before the debtor ever saw it as his own. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. When your employer takes tax money out of your paycheck, whose money is it really the moment it leaves your gross pay? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what comes next is the part of the story that changes how you see business failure, and most people never hear it until a company collapses around them. Return to Onofre Sotelo in the early 1970s. His masonry company withheld federal taxes from employee wages. Those withholdings were supposed to pass through the business and onto the government, but when the company failed, the money was gone. Sotelo argued that the liability under Section 66672 of the tax code was just a penalty, not a true tax, and that bankruptcy should wipe it out. The Supreme Court disagreed in 1978. The court looked past the label and focused on the substance. This money had been taken from workers on the government's behalf. In effect, the business had been carrying other people's money in its pockets. That is the heart of many tax exceptions in bankruptcy. Some taxes are treated like rent you owe. Others are treated like trust money. If you collect or withhold it, you are more like a courier than an owner. Spending it to keep the lights on in a desperate month may feel practical in the moment. But legally, it can look like using your employees' future tax payments as an emergency business loan. And when bankruptcy arrives, that borrowed blood is still on the floor. Not every tax survives bankruptcy. That part is important. History is more precise than panic. Some older income tax debts can sometimes be discharged if strict timing rules are met, but many recent taxes, payroll withholdings, and priority taxes do not go away. The IRS bankruptcy guide still treats some taxes as priority claims, and the basic logic has barely changed since Sotelo. If the state sees the debt as part of its revenue system or as money held for it by someone else, the path to discharge narrows sharply. What did this feel like for ordinary people? It often felt like learning that the company and the owner were not really separate once the wrong kind of tax debt was involved. Small business owners who thought they had taken a commercial risk discovered that the state viewed them as personally responsible stewards. The business could die. The tax claim could keep walking. It is one of the cruelest features of financial collapse. The thing that looked like a business debt suddenly behaves like a family curse. And notice who often gets trapped here. Not giant corporations with layers of lawyers. Not the public companies that can refinance one mistake with another. It is often small operators, builders, restaurant owners, shopkeepers, and contractors. The kind of people who use 1 week's receipts to survive the next. When cash flow dries up, payroll taxes can become the emergency fund that should never be touched. That is why the legal system treats them like a sealed envelope with someone else's name on it. Open it, spend it, and bankruptcy may not protect you. This leads to the second part of this story, and it is even more uncomfortable, because now we move from support and taxes to debts tied directly to punishment. In 1980, Carolyn Robinson pleaded guilty in Connecticut to a larceny charge based on the wrongful receipt of $9,932.95 in welfare benefits. The state court sentenced her to prison, then suspended the sentence and placed her on 5 years of probation. One condition of that probation was restitution. She had to pay $100 a month back through the probation office. In 1981, she filed Chapter 7 bankruptcy, listed the restitution obligation as a debt, and after receiving a discharge, she stopped paying. The case reached the Supreme Court as Kelly v. Robinson in 1986. Again, the court refused to let bankruptcy erase the obligation. Restitution imposed as part of a state criminal sentence, the court said, was not the kind of debt bankruptcy should cancel. Why? Because it was not just about compensating a loss. It was part of punishment, rehabilitation, and the state's criminal justice power. In plain English, bankruptcy can settle accounts between private citizens. It is not supposed to cancel a sentence. That principle reaches beyond restitution. Criminal fines and penalties are also generally protected from discharge. Think about what that means. If ordinary debt is a private broken promise, criminal debt is the state placing a mark on the record and saying this remains part of the consequence. Bankruptcy can close a ledger. It cannot rewrite the verdict. This is where history gets especially uncomfortable because it shows how two legal systems can look at the same dollar amount and see completely different things. If you owe $10,000 because a credit card balance got away from you, bankruptcy may wipe it. If you owe almost the same amount because a criminal court ordered restitution, that number can survive. The digits may look identical. The law says the meaning is not. And the same logic spread into other forms of wrongdoing. Congress and the courts have long resisted letting debtors use bankruptcy to escape liabilities rooted in fraud, embezzlement, or deliberate injury. The United States courts still list debts for willful and malicious injury, which means intentional harm, as common examples of obligations that are not discharged. They also list debts for personal injury caused by drunk driving. That is the same moral thread running through a different fabric. The law is saying bankruptcy is a shelter from failure, not a shield for conduct society wants to condemn. Look at the human experience here. A person who files bankruptcy after a criminal case often expects the process to sweep the whole table clean. Then they learn that the court fine still stands, the restitution order still stands, and interest or collection pressure may still follow. It is like escaping a flood only to discover that one room of the house has been sealed underwater on purpose. The relief is real, but it is partial. Modern law applies the same instinct to certain injury debts as well. The United States courts still list personal injury debts caused by drunk driving as debts that generally are not discharged. That tells you something important about the architecture of the whole system. The law is not simply asking whether money is owed. It is asking how the debt was born. A medical bill from bad luck is one thing. A judgment tied to intoxicated driving is another. One comes from misfortune. The other comes from conduct lawmakers decided should not be rinsed clean by insolvency. To a victim, that difference can mean years of medical costs are not reduced to a line item that disappears in someone else's bankruptcy file. By this point, the pattern is already visible. Support survives because others depend on it. Taxes survive because public money is being protected. Criminal debt survives because punishment is not supposed to be sold off in bankruptcy court. But we are only halfway through the list, and the next exception may be the most famous of all. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they rarely put in textbooks, even though it shapes the financial lives of millions. Now look at all three together. Wetmore in 1904, Sotelo in 1978, Kelly in 1986. Different countries? No. Same country. Different decades. Different facts. Same mechanism. The law keeps asking one question. Is this debt just an unpaid private obligation, or does it touch something lawmakers think must outrank the debtor's fresh start? When the answer is yes, the debt stays alive. And then two later developments made that pattern impossible to ignore. The first involved student loans, the second involved fraud. Together they showed that the circle of non-dischargeable debt was not fixed in stone, it could expand. For much of American history, student loans were dischargeable like many other unsecured debts. That changed step by step. The modern bankruptcy code in 1978 made student loans presumptively non-dischargeable unless the borrower could show undue hardship, which means a level of hardship beyond normal difficulty. In 1990, Congress extended the waiting period for easier discharge from 5 years to 7. In 1998, it removed that time-based escape hatch entirely. In 2005, it expanded the rule to include private student loans too. Over decades, what had once been an ordinary debt was slowly moved behind thicker glass. The person most associated with this change is Marie Brunner. In the early 1980s, Brunner, a recent master's graduate in social work, sought to discharge her student loans. By the time her case reached the Second Circuit in 1987, the court adopted what became known as the Brunner test. To win relief, a debtor had to show three things: that repayment would prevent a minimal standard of living, that this condition was likely to continue for a significant part of the repayment period, and that the debtor had made a good faith effort to repay. Brunner lost. The court noted that only about 10 months had passed since graduation, she had no dependents, and she had filed within a month of the first payment coming due. Whether one agrees with the result or not, the case mattered because it turned hardship into a mountain instead of a hill. Since then, millions of borrowers have lived in the shadow of that standard. Today, student loan balances in the United States stand at roughly $1.65 trillion. And in the third quarter of 2025, about 9.4% of aggregate student debt was reported as 90 or more days delinquent. That is not a footnote. That is a whole generation hearing the sound of old promises knocking at the door. The metaphor here is simple. Student debt used to be a rope. You could cut it in bankruptcy under some conditions. Over time, lawmakers braided it into cable. Now, even when people fall, the line often keeps holding them in place. The fraud cases tell a similar story from another angle. In Hoboken, New Jersey, landlord Edward Cohen had charged tenants more rent than local law allowed. A local administrator ordered him to refund $31,382.50 in excessive rent. When the matter moved through the courts, the bankruptcy court found actual fraud and awarded treble damages, which means triple damages, totaling $94,147.50, plus attorney's fees and costs. In Cohen v. De La Cruz in 1998, the Supreme Court held that all liability arising from the fraud remained non-dischargeable, not just the base amount, the whole chain attached to the fraud. That is a striking fact most people do not know. Once a debt is tied to fraud, the stain can spread outward. Fees, extra damages, and related liability may travel with it. The debt is no longer just about the dollars first taken. It becomes about the wrongful act that produced the whole loss. Again, the legal system is not merely balancing accounts. It is protecting a moral boundary. So now the 6 debts come into focus: child support, alimony, many tax debts, especially recent and trust fund taxes, criminal fines and restitution, most student loans, and debts born from fraud or deliberate harm, the same mechanism, different labels, different decades, same result. Bankruptcy promises a fresh start, but these debts are the parts of the past the law insists on carrying forward. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, and that forces us to ask the hardest question of all. Who pays the real price when these exceptions collide with financial collapse? Usually it is not the wealthy person with layers of assets, skilled counsel, and time to negotiate. It is the middle layer of society, the people living close enough to stability to lose it and too far from wealth to defend it. The custodial parent waiting on support, the small business owner who used payroll taxes to survive one more month, the borrower who thought a degree would open a door and instead found a hallway with no exits, the defendant whose criminal restitution is mathematically impossible to pay, the tenants cheated by a landlord who then tries to wash the fraud away in bankruptcy. History keeps finding the same pressure points because pressure breaks the same bones. Look at the support system. In 2024, child support agencies said they served 12.2 million children and distributed $29.5 billion. That sounds huge, and it is. But the same report said only 65% of current support due was collected, which means millions of families still live in the gap between what the court ordered and what actually arrived. For them, the non-dischargeable nature of support is not a legal curiosity. It is the difference between the law at least trying and the law giving up. Look at restitution. A Government Accountability Office report found that by the end of fiscal year 2016, $110 billion in federal criminal restitution remained outstanding, and $100 billion of that was identified as uncollectible because offenders could not pay. That number is haunting. It tells you that the system insists the debt should survive, even when everyone quietly understands much of it may never be recovered. The debt becomes like a bell that keeps ringing in an empty valley. It signals moral judgment more than realistic collection. Look at student loans. A balance of $1.65 trillion is not just an accounting figure. It is years delayed, homes bought later, children postponed, careers chosen for payment instead of purpose, credit damaged by missed bills that were invisible for years and then suddenly reported. In 2025, Federal student loan delinquencies jumped after previously unreported missed payments began appearing on credit reports. History does not repeat an exact costume, but it loves familiar choreography. A debt once sold as an investment in the future starts behaving like a tax on the present. And look at fraud debts. Here the pain runs in both directions. Victims need the debt to survive because otherwise bankruptcy can feel like a second theft. But the debtor may emerge from court carrying a liability that keeps growing long after the original act. The law chooses a side. It says the fresh start stops where deceit begins. Who walks away fine? Usually the people who never confuse ordinary debt with protected debt. The ones who know that withheld payroll taxes are not working capital. That child support is not a negotiable expense. That a restitution order is not just another bill. That student loans live by different rules. Knowledge in these moments works like a flashlight in a mine. It does not remove the tunnels. It keeps you from stepping into the shaft you never saw. There is also a modern twist that makes these old cases feel uncomfortably alive. Debts no longer arrive one at a time. A household can carry student loans, tax trouble from gig work, support obligations from an earlier marriage, and legal fines from a single bad incident all at once. When those layers stack, bankruptcy still helps with many things, but the protected debts remain like steel rods inside wet concrete. The structure changes shape around them. This is why people can emerge from bankruptcy relieved and trapped at the same time. Their credit card balances may be gone. Their lease deficiency may be gone. Yet the debts that matter most to daily stress can still be standing in the doorway, unchanged. History shows that the emotional shock often comes not from filing, but from discovering what the filing did not touch. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. The historical record shows that people who came through these periods with less damage usually shared 3 broad traits. First, they learned early which debts were ordinary and which debts had iron bars around them. That sounds obvious. It is not. Many debtors enter crisis assuming all unsecured obligations behave roughly the same. History shows the opposite. A dollar owed for a credit card balance and a dollar owed for support may look like twins on paper. In court, they are distant cousins. Second, the survivors tended to face reality sooner. They did not wait for the floor to collapse before noticing the cracks. Small business owners who understood payroll tax exposure often cut staff, sold assets, or sought formal arrangements earlier rather than spending trust fund taxes in hope of a miracle. Parents who knew support could not be discharged were more likely to treat it as a fixed pillar, not a bill to skip. Borrowers who understood student loans were unusually stubborn debts often sought deferment, income-driven plans, or negotiated relief long before default hardened around them. None of this guaranteed safety. It simply kept a bad season from becoming a lifetime weather pattern. Third, the people who survived best usually preserved documents and respected procedure. That sounds boring, but history is full of people ruined not only by debt, but by missing paper. Tax returns filed late can affect whether old taxes are dischargeable. A failure to ask for deferment can matter in student loan hardship cases. Proof of payment matters in support disputes. Fraud cases turn on records, timing, and written statements. Collapse is rarely one dramatic explosion. More often, it is a staircase of missed notices. Notice what I am not saying. I am not saying the system is fair in every case. It is not. I am not saying every non-dischargeable debt reflects moral guilt. Student loans prove that quickly. I am not saying knowledge alone solves insolvency, which means being unable to pay debts as they come due. It does not. I am saying the people who did less badly usually understood the map before they walked into the swamp. And this is where history offers one final warning. These exceptions tend to expand when lawmakers fear abuse, moral weakness, or public loss. That is how student loans moved from ordinary debt toward near-permanent status. That is how support obligations were placed ever more firmly at the front of the line. Once an exception is built, it rarely shrinks. It usually hardens. That is why these cases still rhyme with the present. A modern household may earn money from apps, borrow for school online, manage support through state portals, and face collections driven by algorithms. The technology changes, the categories do not. History does not say everyone carrying these debts will fail. It says the legal structure waiting beneath them is older, stricter, and less forgiving than most people assume. So return one last time to that small business owner in Illinois in 1973. He thought bankruptcy might place the business in the ground and let the family walk away. But the payroll taxes had a different legal character. They were treated as money held for the government, not a failed business gamble. The company died, the obligation did not. That is the central lesson of this history. Bankruptcy can wipe out many promises made in the marketplace. It is far less willing to erase duties tied to children, the state, punishment, or wrongdoing. The same was true for Annette Wetmore's unpaid support in New York. It was true for Carolyn Robinson's restitution in Connecticut. It became true for Marie Brunner's student debt in New York. It was true for Edward Cohen's fraud liability in New Jersey. Different lives, different courts, same hard edge in the law. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Bankruptcy is not a universal pardon. It is a sorting machine, and the debts that survive are usually the ones lawmakers believe touch dependence, public trust, punishment, or moral blame. Those debts move through bankruptcy like stones through water. Everything around them shifts. They remain. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.